Good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, thank you, Michael, for inviting me to come out, and to your team for putting all this together, inviting us to beautiful Calgary. And thank you all for attending. So in this paper, I've already looked at the exchanges between the passengers on the Komagata Maru and the Canadian Imperial government of the time, while the ship sat in the harbour for 60 days. And some of that exchange is the backdrop to the resistance to the lies and deception that was happening on the shore against what was happening in the water. So I also make a bit of a jump that, I suggest that the Komagata Maru was part of the revolutionary movement that started in the Northwest and against a colonial power, and became kind of that lightning rod for people to go back to India and fight the British rule. Okay, so I have 30 minutes or 20 minutes. I'm going to talk really fast. This is a paper that I haven't published yet, but it's coming out soon. Imperial historians have been concerned about how the manifestation of colonial nationalism has been closely correlated to the rise in overtly discriminatory legislation in the British Empire. Both itineraries are evident in the journey of the Komagata Maru, first from its ideological inception, which I suggest is to counter exclusionary laws in Canada, and this happened in Hong Kong, to its forced removal from Canadian waters in 1914. While the itineraries of the empire furthered their cause of expansion and control, native states under their control suffered the consequences of exclusion, of racial demarcations, of class division, and extreme white supremacy. Under the legal structure of the Crown, no individual ever gained citizenship in the empire. Rather, they were accorded subjecthood with unequal rights that Dominion colonies eroded with free will and concerted effort in the local context. Canada's history is also replete with imperial phenomena of assigning alien status to natives in their own lands, with the Foreign Jurisdiction Act of 1890, assuming that the people they were putting this act upon were inherently consensual. The interconnectedness between similar experiences of colonial exclusion had been felt by many Asian communities prior to the immigration from India. At the time of the Komagata Maru's arrival in BC in 1914, South Asians and other Asian immigrants already faced intense jurisdictional discrimination, legislative racism, public resentment, and political hostility. Between 1904 and 1907, about 5,000 South Asians had immigrated to BC, following in the footsteps of approximately 35,000 Chinese and Japanese immigrants to these shores. Punjabi immigrants arriving in BC from British-occupied India came with the conflicted ideas of loyalty on one side to the empire, based on the Punjabi rural peasantry sentimental notions of the Raj as Mai Baap, both mother and father, of service, of duty, of cooperation, but all the while recognizing also that they were being treated as second-class citizens in India while they were being exploited economically and socially. These immigrants who came to Canada faced innumerable barriers upon arrival. Nonetheless, they came, initially as economic immigrants, much like many others from other parts of the world, and then Sikhs were, and later on in family and class immigrants as well. Sikhs were also under the misguided notion of shared imperial citizenship. However, there was no reciprocal trust and loyalty by the Crown, and no recognition in India as equal British citizens. And Bhagat Singh said in his book Zulmi Katha, and I quote, "Those who have no status at home are ipso facto deprived of any abroad." And in his memoirs, Bhagat Singh wrote, and I quote, "We were poor Indians seeking to enter Canada to earn our livelihood, and we thought we had every right to enter there, as India as well as Canada were under the British Crown. When even the slum dweller of London could freely move to India as well as Canada, why should not we? We are insulted, we are dishonored, and we are disgraced in all parts of the world because we have no government that will feel the indignities inflicted upon us, as the British government did not respond." Sikh eminent service in the British Army had precluded the coolie status that had been afforded to other immigrants, and the patterns of Sikh immigration in regiments stationed abroad had given them a particularly free and fairly unimpeded access to other colonies across Africa and Asia. Gorman writes, and he's critical of the value of imperial citizenship in the colonies. He writes, "The concept of imperial subjecthood, after all, guaranteed freedom of movement throughout the empire. But this was not true for those Indians who came on the Komagata Maru. There was no empire-wide common citizenship policy or protection, although Indians had been mistakenly led to believe that British subject meant equal rights. Although at one imperial conference held in England, Canadian Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier offered this view, and I quote, "A man who was a British subject anywhere should be a British subject everywhere." He would soon find fault with his own words and renege on his political stand. Anti-imperialist sentiment had risen in India, subsequent to the first mutiny of 1857, forcing the British to become aware of their tenuous position as rulers in India. In the case of the Komagata Maru, in regard to India and more broadly to the empire, dependent on its colonies, the notion of a common imperial citizenship codified in Britannic alliance ran aground. Punjab had been the last to be annexed as a province by the British in 1849, and although the Punjabi warrior tradition was held in high regard by the colonial rulers, Punjabis were also aware of the deep-seated prejudice and racism manifest in the Raj. Ships plying the Pacific Ocean brought Indian men to the shores of BC who quickly joined the rebellious movement starting along the coast at the turn of the century. Dissatisfied both with the exclusionary and racially motivated Canadian conditions in the law and the second-class life of their compatriots living under British Raj in India. A huge intelligence gathering had become the order of the day for imperial officials in Canada, and it was well known that men were being recruited to spy upon each other. I suggest that the unfulfilled voyage of the Komagata Maru was a profound personal and collective letdown for Punjabi Sikhs, who felt that they had had an amicable and special relationship with the Raj. The Komagata Maru tragedy was also the precursor and contributor to the growing nationalist movement in the Pacific Northwest called the Gadar. 5 days after the morning of July 23, 1914, when the Komagata Maru was escorted out of Burrard Inlet, Austria declared war on Serbia. Canada and India, like the rest of the British Empire, was at war. India contributed to the war effort with 400,000 Punjabis who fought for the empire in various parts of the world at the same time that they were being denied their rights in another daughter colony. Gurdwaras, I want to talk a little bit about Gurdwaras and their role, in the dual role as socio-religious institutions with a long history as places of refuge for the weary and travelers in India and abroad and wherever diaspora communities settled. The institution also provides political, moral, and financial support to movements of political change and social rebellion, even in very recent times. One such Gurdwara in Hong Kong was a temporary home to many Sikhs traveling in Southeast Asia in the early 1900s. Many soldiers were traveling around the colonies, and some were entrepreneurs looking to create new homes and to make economic gains that would further solidify and increase their agricultural holdings in Punjab through remittances of money back home. One desired destination for these soldiers and entrepreneurs was Canada. Many had been stranded in Hong Kong for some time due to the legal bans imposed by Canadian authorities on migration. And a significant event was going to change all that. At the Hong Kong Gurdwara, a sabha was held on December of 1913, where a proposal to charter a steamship on their own was discussed to meet the continuous journey restriction, a law so meticulously designed that it provided effective restriction while avoiding the outwardly distasteful connotation of race. A businessman of some means, Bhagat Singh Sarhali, came forward to undertake the task in a singular act of non-violence, as he says, as a direct challenge to the blatant exclusion of Indians from immigration to Canada. As plans got underway to procure a seaworthy vessel, the far reach of the empire was felt, as attempts were made to prevent the ship from sailing by imperial officials in Hong Kong. However, after a few months of planning, the Komagata Maru was hired and renamed the Guru Nanak Jahaz, setting sail for Vancouver from Yokohama on April 4, 1914, with a total of 376 passengers, of which 2 were women. Dr. Raghunath Singh's wife, who was the medical officer on the ship, was one woman, and her name is not known to us. And there was she had a son, Kishan, and she had one son. The other woman was Kishan Kaur Tumowal, with 1 daughter and 1 son, and there was a 7-year-old son of Gurdit Singh Balwant Singh. The story of the women is largely silent, while the Komagata Maru narrative focuses on the male story. The anti-gendered narrative of South Asian immigration focuses on a ban on women to join spouses and became the source of much intelligence gathering and fear-mongering. Immigration agent J.D. Scott wrote to the immigration branch, and I quote, "The coming of their women is the concern of a certain amount of apprehension and will doubtless lead to trouble." End of quote. The prospect of permanency through family created race-fueled apprehension by persons of European descent already living here with their families intact. Having created a permanent space for their own kind, their aversion to the so-called Oriental was rife. Now, passengers faced deplorable conditions on the ship, and which was common on the many journeys made by previous passengers, and it made them very unhappy, but they persevered in hopes for a better tomorrow. Gurdeep Singh's memoirs talk about how he kept their spirits up and through religious hymns that were sung by a Dardi Jatha that accompanied the ship, as preachers were allowed freely to come to Canada, and a part on the accompanying Sri Guru Granth Sahib occurred morning, afternoon, and evening. However, when they arrived, they were denied berth and entry into the harbour, and they could not disembark. The immigrants had waited on deck with bags properly packed, and actually the photo you see outside on this exhibition is from that point, in their best clothes, but they were appalled and dejected by the treatment meted out by Canadian officials, loyal to the same crown that they had pledged allegiance to and loyalty to up till now. The media was also merciless, using a racial slant and overtones fanned by a highly charged imperialist comments by public officials like the Premier of BC, who suggested that inclusion would lead to extinction of the white race, and in what was supposed to be a white man's country. He said, and I quote, "To admit Orientals in large numbers would mean in the end the extinction of the white people, and we have always in mind the necessity of keeping this a white man's country," end of quote. And this social identity of whiteness drove the political discourse of citizenship in the settlement colonies. In writing about social justice, Rajinder Kaur suggests that the policies of oppression and violence against non-whites were morally and ethically justified in the British Empire under a fabled assumption of superiority. The whites had started to create a racial consciousness of their whiteness as being separate and superior to other races. Gurdeep Singh's challenge flaunted their own preoccupation with their race. Overt and discriminatory white-centric Canadian nationalism was never far from the fore, normalized in the rhetoric of British imperialism. Prime Minister Mackenzie wrote at that time, and I quote, "that Canada should desire to restrict immigration from the Orient is regarded as natural. That Canada should remain a white man's country is believed to be not only desirable for economic and social reasons, but highly necessary on political and national grounds." Incipient nationalism in Canada to create a homogeneous communal society based on European ideals has no room for the Oriental. As a nationalist, the right of dominion and autonomy for King over Canada was paramount, but he was also, this is Mackenzie King, but he was also mindful of the obligations of imperial demands in relation to Asian members of the empire, while rejecting intra-empire movements and travels. Unless that intra-empire movement was part of the coerced and voluntary migration in what Madhavi Kale coins imperial labor reallocation of over hundreds of thousands of Indian men and women to serve the empire's interests in the colonies between 1837 and 1917. And Mackenzie King went as far as to say it was not so unchristian to want to sell men into slavery. By 1920, there were almost 1.3 million Indians working as indentured laborers in squalid conditions throughout the British Empire, held under false licenses that limited their human experiences. The imperialist desire was to build homogeneous but not inclusive communities in settler communities across the colonies, quite in opposition to their own imperial invasions and conquests across the globe. They believed that, for example, the importation of Chinese labor into South Africa upset the racial and cultural consensus of empire. The idea of limiting citizenship within the empire was built on seeking homogeneity, not inclusion, based on a well-embedded mentality of cultural elitism and constitutional hegemony. Racist assumptions thus fed upon economic and cultural fears to create an environment particularly amenable to the implementation of discriminatory policies. Creative ways were found in Canada to implement policies that would prevent migration from India. In particular, the route from India to Canada became the currency for continuous movement. an impossibility the policymakers were very aware of. Radhika Mongia has termed this the policy of racial exclusion without naming race. In 1908, Deputy Minister of Labour Mackenzie King travelled to India as part of his trip to Asia to assure the British Raj that Canada would restrict movements of people from India while keeping in mind the colonial sensibilities. British officials like Governor Lord Minto were satisfied with the measures taken by Prime Minister Mackenzie King upon his return. Mackenzie King in his report wrote, "The liberty of British subjects in India is safeguarded rather than curtailed. The traditional policy of Britain in respect to the native races of India have been kept in mind, and the necessity of enacting legislation, either in India or in Canada, which might appear to reflect on fellow British subjects in another part of the empire, has been wholly avoided." So that's why I take a deviating view from Hugh's comments that they weren't interested in what was happening in India. Laws were implemented that excluded immigrants at Canadian ports who did not meet the requirement, and two categories of people were created, as Ali Kazemi has coined, the undesirables and the desirables. It became obvious that in case of the desirables coming from Europe, discretionary powers could be exercised, while Asians were to be blocked with whatever means were available to them. The mayor of Vancouver said, "The East Indian is not a desirable citizen, and when I say that, I am backed by public opinion." Racial profiling and hate-mongering was obviously at play. While in May 1908, the Indian law that prohibited Indians to go to countries like Canada that it did not have an agreement with for contract services was intact, if they came of free will, nothing could stop them. So the device by Frank Oliver, Minister of the Interior, as the only remedy to increase the amount on immigrants, the amount of money that immigrants must have in their possession was as high as $200, an exorbitant amount that would be difficult to procure for most people. The clause, however, this is really critical, the clause exempted traders like Gurdjieff Singh, preachers like the Tadi Jatha on board the Komagata Maru, students, of which there were many on board, and any tourist and government officials. The restrictions came at a time when there was unprecedented, even at today's count, of desired immigrants. 400,000 immigrants came in that 1 year, all from Europe. Sikh historian Bhagat Singh claims, "It was not the immigration law that worked in Canada at that time, it was that intense racist feeling that pervaded the whole white scenario. So in this situation, the lawyers, who had already been taking up the cases of Indians with great interest, refused to take the cases of the passengers of the Komagata Maru. The racist sentiment had superseded the law." But Gurdjieff Singh was undaunted, and he wrote to the Canadian immigration official Malcolm Reid. He wrote, "What is done with this shipload of my people will determine whether we shall have peace in all parts of the British Empire." And again, although Gurdjieff Singh may not have been sophisticated enough to understand parliamentary law and what he could and could not litigate against, he was aware that this one movement of the ship would impact the British Empire's position in India. And indeed, the event fanned the embers of the nationalist Ghadar movement, already gathering steam in BC and on the northwest coastal cities in the US. As Hugh Johnston claims, based on the ethnography of many passengers after they arrived in India, it was what happened on the ship that made them revolutionaries and pro-India nationalists. Although it is evident that the Komagata Maru passengers were sympathetic to the Ghadar movement, their primary goal was to fight the discriminatory immigration laws. Historians surmise that the incident was the beginning of the end of the British Empire as far as the Sikhs were concerned. While the passengers said over and over again that they had come obeying the laws of Canada and had met its requirement, the Vancouver Sun on 24th of June 1914 editorialized, and I quote, "The presence of these people would prove a serious menace to our civilization, both economically and socially, besides intensifying the present unsatisfactory labor conditions." End of quote. Canada's immigration policy had been riddled with social opinion, which permeated the sentiments of officials in charge of giving justice to the same people that they were denying rights to. Guards were posted to patrol the waters in armed boats with a view to intimidate and secure compliance. Legal justice was denied, as the passenger's lawyer, Mr. Edward Bird, was not allowed to visit the ship to get legal instructions from his clients. Imperial authorities also circumvented their own laws with abandon. A letter to the Daily Editor news advertiser on July 10, 1914, on behalf of the passengers, signed by Harnam Singh, Veer Singh, Harman Singh, Sundar Singh, and Amar Singh, said, and I quote, "Immigration Department did not give us a single chance for a lawyer to come on board to see us and take our thoughts to plead our case. For this, the Immigration Department is held responsible, and we are quite blameless, and have come here by all rights to land." Gurudit Singh pleaded as a merchant that he should not be prohibited from landing, as he told the officials that he had undertaken this enterprise for pecuniary benefits, not with a view to permanently settle in Canada. His fight was exclusively against racial discrimination and atrocious immigration laws. Even a letter on July 8, a conciliatory and pleading letter asking for landing rights with conditions that they would work on farms in Alberta or in BC, or other conditions if somebody did not farm, fell on deaf ears. The tone of the passengers' letters was always courteous, in keeping with the master-slave colonial expectation. And I quote, "I have the honor to inform you that we have neither provisions nor water on board. Our provisions ran short from this morning, and the water too shall be finished tomorrow. I request you, therefore, that you may please arrange to send the both things today. I have the honor to be, sir, your most obedient servant," signed Bhagat Singh, Secretary to the Charter. A.H. McNeil, one of the lawyers for the passengers, wrote to the Prime Minister stating, "The attitude of the local immigration people and the local politicians was such as not to admit to any negotiation or settlement on any terms. The whole matter could have been readily avoided by the exercise of some slight degree of diplomacy and consideration for the people who were on board, as well as their friends." Gurudit Singh also wrote to the King and Governor-General of Canada about the lack of provisions, prisoner-like conditions for the passengers, and Malcolm Reed's refusal to let supplies on the ship. The imperial response by London, through the Governor-General of Canada, to the officials was to provide supplies, allow the lawyer to interview and let the cargo be removed, as he feared the larger repercussions on the Crown by its largest colony. In conclusion, I suggest that upholding the Immigration Act and the Order in Council was based on a biased interpretation of the exclusionary immigration regulations by a panel of 5 judges deciding on a single test case, that of Munshi Singh. Since Munshi Singh's case was denied, and very summarily, Gurudit Singh had no option but to leave the shores in his ship, as appeals to the higher courts would not happen until October. He demanded provisions, but the imperial dimensions of the crisis were not really understood by the locals or the immigration officials, who were hell-bent to evict the ship through a show of force and sheer weight of racially charged antagonism. Minister of Agriculture was summoned to the coast by the Prime Minister to diffuse tensions and to find a not-so-volatile solution. What kept the whole situation from deteriorating into an armed conflict under Malcolm Reed, Hopkinson, and Stephen's watch was a cynically imperial view that the British Raj would suffer in India if blood was shed in Canada. Indian Viceroy Lord Hardinge made no mention of the massive monetary contributions by Indians on the shore, or the hardships faced by the passengers, his British subjects. Rather, in his letter to Prime Minister King, he made note of the $4,000 of provisions provided by the government. He stated that the government of India watched the entire incident, but there was no reason for them to intervene. This ended the chapter of a ship that was unmoored from its rightful place on Canadian soil by the undignified and immoral nationalist imperial agenda of exclusion. The passengers were in turn turned over to imperial authorities in India, who meted out an injustice that further solidified the nationalist movement in India and abroad. When the Komagata Maru was escorted out of the Vancouver harbour at the ambrosial hour of 5:10 a.m. on July 23, 1914, under heavy military presence, it left in its wake a community torn apart through racial conflict and an empire that would see the sunset on its vast ambitions. Imperial itineraries of nationalism, deception, and racism had shaped and defined the experiences of 376 passengers and both nations, creating a historically significant moment in Canadian history that seeks positioning with the larger discourse of race, lies, and deception at work in the empire. It also gives a powerful stimulus to the anti-imperial propaganda, awakening national consciousness in the hearts of Indians in India and in the diaspora. Thank you.